rationing. And the Screen magazine, in its second issue, tried to explain to me and he wanted to know that what he could do if they would in world greater cities become a monument to the courage and faith of the unsouthern Americans. Buffalo Hunter, who with his great shirt made the old well from these broken streets and hungry ruins, there moved a great...
Hello, my name is Dean Cotover, and this is a history show. Today we have a gentleman who was in Vietnam. He retired as a lieutenant colonel, but he was a lieutenant in Vietnam. He was a Pathfinder. He was a ranger. He was a master parachutist. He was a lieutenant in Vietnam. His name is Mike Farquhar, right?
Farquhar.
Farquhar, and commonly known as Iron Mike, right?
Right.
And you have a website called ironmike.com?
No, Rabid Republican blog.
Rabid Republican blog. All right, get that in there. All right. He was enlisted man initially, went in the military in the early 60s, right? You took basic training where?
Took basic training in 1961 at Fort Ord, California, which has now been turned back to the civilians.
Right. Nice place.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful place. I drove by there. I didn't realize they had beachfront property on Fort Ord. It was amazing. You were in the military initially 3 years.
3 years.
You went airborne after basic training?
Went to artillery school at Fort Carson.
Fort Carson.
Went
Okay.
to
Colorado.
Fort Carson, Colorado. We literally were there in January, October, November, December, watching them build Cheyenne Mountain, the hollowed out mountain that is now the NORAD headquarters.
Right.
We watched that being built.
Wow.
And it was cold. Mm-hmm. Coldest I've ever been was in Fort Carson.
Wow.
And then went to jump school at Fort Benning and on to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell.
Cheyenne Mountain is basically built out of a mountain right near Colorado Springs, is that correct?
Yep.
And the Air Force Academy is there.
Air Force Academy is there, Cheyenne Mountain, Fort Carson.
Fort Carson.
Fort Carson had just been reopened. You have to understand your history. This was the Berlin crisis. This was the buildup. The East Germans and the Russians had just started when the day I joined the Army.
Wow.
They were so scared they started building the Berlin Wall.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all told we were going to be going over there immediately because the Army was thin, it needed to be reinforced, and
wow.
The crisis calmed down.
But they called up units,
and
National Guard units.
They did that, and they literally reopened Fort Carson. Had been closed since the end of World War II, and so Fort Carson had been built hastily in World War II. Many of the buildings out of green pine that weathered, and the knots dropped out.
Oh wow!
And the wind would whistle through those barracks like Swiss cheese. And the World War II GIs had taken the ends of tin cans and nailed them over the holes. But that'd been a while.
Right.
So they were pretty cold at night.
Wow. So they didn't have any permanent buildings, they were temporary.
At the time. Fort Carson is a lovely place now, but
right.
In 1961, it was primitive going.
Okay. So you're at Fort Carson, you remember anything about Fort Carson?
I remember the only day it came above freezing was the afternoon of parents' open house.
Oh, no kidding.
And about 4 o'clock, the parents departed, the wind picked up, and the mud froze. And so it was the entire time we were there, it was below freezing, except for that one afternoon.
Okay. You go to airborne school. Yep. Airborne school is 3 weeks?
3 weeks.
Okay.
Once again, nothing in the military is as it's planned.
Right.
They were expecting 300 troops in January.
At airborne school?
At Fort Benning.
Okay, Fort Benning.
They got 3,000.
Wow.
The Army was just starting to use computers.
Okay.
So they got 3,000. So we were there actually a month and finished up and stuck on buses and taken up to Fort Campbell. So I've been back to Fort Benning many, many times, as recently as 2 months ago. And boy, it's changed. Boy, it's changed.
Fort Benning is, or always has been, airborne school at Fort Benning besides infantry.
We've had other airborne schools. Bragg had one for a while.
Right.
Campbell had one. They used to run one in Germany, I believe in Wiesbaden for a while. But the primary jump school for basic airborne is Fort Benning.
Okay.
And all services send their people there now.
I noticed that you have airborne wings on your hat.
Yep.
My question is, when do you get the airborne wings? What's the criteria to?
You get the basic wings after your 5th jump.
Okay.
Even if you break your leg, they'll
Right.
give you the wings.
Okay. That's
and
static line jumping.
That's static line jumping, yeah. And then you'll get your senior wings after a minimum of 30 qualifying jumps.
Night?
Some of which must be at night, some of which must have combat equipment, several of which must be as a jump master. And you must be by then a graduate of the Jump Master School, which is 2 weeks.
Right.
Then after 65 jumps, which includes more night jumps, more combat jumps, more jumps as a jump master, you get the master wings. And
Tell me about combat jumps. What's that entail at night?
combat jumps.
At night.
You were talking about combat jumps or combat equipment?
Combat equipment
Combat
at
equipment.
night.
Combat equipment at night is fun.
You had to make me laugh.
You have to have a sense of humor.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing wrong with that.
You have to understand that as any paratrooper will tell you, you'll spend a lot of time wearing the harness, hanging around, waiting on the Air Force, waiting on the weather, waiting on someone to make a decision. For every jump you make, you may actually put on a parachute 3 times, just because stuff doesn't go right. A combat equipment jump, you wear everything that you would wear into a combat jump in a wartime. It typically back then was a pack, now it's a rucksack. It's your load-bearing gear, which contains your ammo, your water, food, trenching tool,
Right.
whatever other specialty tools you need for your job.
Like a radio if you're a radio
Oh,
operator.
yes.
Okay.
All that stuff. And it can get pretty heavy. So the parachute and the reserve will weigh about 45 pounds.
You have 1 or 2 parachutes.
2.
Okay.
Assuming they like you, and that you're jumping high enough for the reserve to work. If you're jumping under 700 feet, very often the decision will be made no reserves because there's not time to activate it. You got 1 chance. And then you'll have additional equipment that'll be on you, either that you're wearing or that's hung on you. And so it can be a little uncomfortable to get up out of your seat. You waddle. People have to help you. Your buddies pull each other up. To get hooked up and shuffle on out the door.
Hooked up
And,
means what?
You have a static line. It's like a big hook.
Okay.
And you hook it over a cable
All right.
and snap it. And put a wire through to make sure it doesn't come unsnapped. And it gets checked a few times. And that's what you're heading down to the door, pushing that ahead of you. And it stays behind. It's what pulls the parachute out. That's unlike a skydive where the whole jumper
Right.
goes out and he's responsible for his own.
Right.
It's a big relief to get out of that airplane because it's pretty uncomfortable and cramped. And if the ride's been rough and your buddies had a bad lunch, it may smell bad. You get out, it's beautiful for a little while, it's quiet. It's amazing how just going through the door of an airplane, everything is suddenly quiet. And then pretty soon the ground comes up and you hit, with a little luck, you hit gracefully, and if not, you hit with a thud. And you pick yourself up, and then you carry all that stuff off the drop zone.
What do you do with the parachute?
Typically, you roll it up into a kit bag and carry it and the reserve off and turn it in. Once in a rare while, in the old days, we would have a truly combat simulated jump, where you would leave the chute as it was.
On the ground?
On the ground.
Or do you bury it?
No, you
No.
leave it right there.
Okay.
We're talking about mass unit jumps. We're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
talking about special forces
Right.
jumps. Mass
Okay.
unit
All
jumps. You're basically going in to see someone's airport or see someone's capital city or some strategic road junction or something.
Right.
You're going in to take ground.
Right. And the philosophy is to land right there or right near the
On or
position.
near. On or near. The lessons of World War II are embedded in the DNA of the airborne. You land on or near. It's
We're not talking about 5 miles away. We're talking about a half a mile or a quarter mile away if possible.
Yeah, you're talking about as close
Close
as you
as you
can
can
humanly
get.
get and not land in the trees or the power lines.
What happens if you land in the trees and the power lines? What's the philosophy?
At that point, you will have religion. And you may even announce to the good Lord that you've you've had a rebirth. I've been very lucky and have not had a power line landing. People have survived them, but others have not.
Tree landing?
Tree landings can be a bit dicey depending upon the kind of trees. I've had several. We won't talk about them here. I've survived them all, but they can be a little scary. And
They're out there, the trees.
they're out there, and nighttime they'll find you.
What about water? What's the philosophy on water? If you're going to land in the lake or a river or something like that.
Water landing, you do a whole different thing in terms of getting ready to land, which is you basically all but climb out of the parachute. You're hanging by maybe doing a pull-up, literally in it at the last
So you
minute.
cut it away.
You
Is
don't
that
cut it away.
or-
You're still
just-
water can be hard, okay, but you start climbing out of it as much as you can because too many paratroopers have drowned. The reserve will float briefly, but if you're in that stuff, it will drag you under. Your combat equipment will certainly drag you under.
That's true.
I mean, you're dropping
That's
with
reality.
50, 60, supposedly the maximum weight, external weight that you're supposed to be able to jump was 90 pounds. I don't know what the kids are doing today, but it's a lot of weight and it doesn't float. Now, if they know, they know ahead of time that you're going to be on, near, or flying over water, you'll be issued water wings. But again, even water wings won't hold you up if you've got 90 to 100 pounds pulling you under. So it's a whole different landing. You practice it in jump school. You hope you never have to do it.
What's streaming in the airborne?
Streaming in is when the main chute fails to fully deploy and the jumper fails to activate his reserve, or does, and it gets tangled with it. They've had a number of things call it. In the old days, they used to call it a Roman candle or a streamer. And most people don't survive them.
Have you ever seen that when the combat jump?
I was on a 3-plane jump one night down at Bragg, and the company commander's RTO, radio telephone operator.
Right, RTO, yeah, I'm familiar.
On the other plane was supposedly the 3rd or 4th man out, supposedly. And as it turned out, when we found him on the ground, he was still holding his snap hook. So we don't know what happened, but that's a case of his parachute never had a chance to come out because the static line never pulled on it. He was still holding it. Somebody let him out the door that way.
But isn't that the responsibility of the jump master?
Yeah, we were, many of us were very upset that young captain was exonerated for that night's tragedy. It was the military, as we tell people in the airborne, every stitch, every buckle, everything on your harness, everything on that parachute, every procedure that we have is there because someone died to prove that we needed it.
Right.
Okay.
Good point.
In this case, procedures were not followed, and this kid ended up dead. And you know, we can talk about that on another show. But I mean, it's just one of those situations where a series of bad things ended up with a kid dead on the ground.
And somebody's mother or father had to get a notice in the mail.
They got the chaplain in pulling up in the sedan.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, so you're, I'm sorry, you're at airborne school, you get out of airborne school, you're happy, and then you're in the military artillery? Are you in the
initially I was
airborne
in the
artillery?
Yeah, initially I was in an airborne field artillery battery.
Okay.
And I spent about 14 months in that.
What were you in the artillery unit, in the group, whatever they call it, the gun? What were you? What was your specific job?
Once I got to Fort Campbell, I never got to play with the guns.
Oh.
I became a field wireman.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
And
in other words, you set the landlines.
The landlines.
As an airborne trooper.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
And then after I'd done that for 4, 5, 6 months somewhere.
Did you climb the poles?
We climbed poles, we climbed trees, we did all kinds of stuff. We had all kinds of ways of laying wire.
Can I say something? In the military, in regards to landlines, you might not believe it, but landlines are very important because a lot of times the enemy could pick up your radio, So you want landlines, and this gentleman, Iron Mike, had to lay landlines, and even in combat situations, you have to to put out landlines.
Yep.
So the guy ringing the phone. Remember the field phones?
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah.
Good for communication and good for fishing.
The lines or the phone?
The phone. You crank that sucker up. You know. Anyway, that's.
Well, some people used to use it for torture. All right. The landlines. Sometimes what would happen is, you playing war games, you get captured. They use the phone as an electrical charge.
Yep.
And they put the 2 wires on your ears.
Or someplace.
And they would crank up the energy in the phone, and it was also used for that.
It's called dialing for answers.
Never heard that one before, but Mike, I like that one. So that's what landlines.
Yeah. So I did that for a while, and then somebody said, well, he can read a map and he knows how to talk on the radio, so we'll make a FO driver out of him. I was a driver for the forward observer section.
All right.
And then I went off and tried my hand at Special Forces for a while, and then came back to the...
So you went through Special Forces school?
I started the training, never made it all the way through the first time.
Okay, the first time.
And...
that's a tough school.
Well, it is, and it was just growing. John Kennedy was the president at the time, had expanded it. They were anxious to expand.
Right.
Looking back at it, in great hindsight, you know, you need a certain level of maturity for that kind of stuff, and 19-year-olds tend not to have that. So I ended up back at Fort Campbell in the 506th Airborne, which was an airborne battle group. It was a pentomic division, meaning it had 5 major subdivisions of the division, each one a battle group. Each one of those had 5 companies. And I ended up in the mortar battery and got my first opportunity at real leadership.
What rank were you at that time?
At that time, I was still a PFC.
Okay.
And I'd been a PFC for a while, and I was a pretty strack one. But
I haven't heard that term in a long time.
I know you haven't. So, you know, everything in my life has been pretty much by accident. And I walked in there and reported to a first sergeant named Dudley Scott. wonderful old soldier, World War II soldier. He looked at my record, looked at me and said, "How long you been at PFC?" And I said, 19 months. And he
Wow,
said,
that's unusual.
and he said, "Did you screw up?" I said, "Not really." He says, "Well, I got a problem." He says, "I've got 21 wiremen upstairs. They don't know what they're doing." He says, "You give me a wire team, I'll make you a Spec 4. You give me 2 wire teams or a wire team and a switchboard, I'll make you a Spec 5. You give me all 3, I'll make you a buck sergeant."
Wow. So that
And
we're
tell
talking
you,
about E2, E3, E4.
At
pay
the
grade.
time I was an E3, so
Right.
he was promising me gold, and boy did he light a fire, and fortunately he was the kind of first sergeant who knew how to mentor. He wasn't just yelling and screaming. He was the kind who knew how to mentor. And between him and the battery commander, I knew I had backup. I knew the job, so he turned loose a tiger, and I did exactly that. I gave him a wire team, a switchboard section. I was working on the second wire team. He made me Spec 4 on time. At that point, the Army, in its great wisdom, decided to reorganize the entire 101st. And we went from a pentomic division to a ROAD division. And I was now in a different unit, and ended up going to Ranger School and making sergeant anyway. So
How long did Ranger School take?
back then it was 9 weeks.
Would you say Special Forces is tougher or Ranger or as equal, seeing that you went to both? That's a tough question.
It's a tough question because you're comparing apples and oranges. Both do some of the same things, both train some of the same techniques.
Right.
The physical requirements are maybe the same. The endurance challenges are very similar. I have seen good Special Forces people not make it through Ranger School. I've seen good Rangers not make it through Special Forces School. There's a different mental requirement.
Oh, okay.
Different, okay? The guy who's a great truck driver for an 18-wheeler, who maybe is the guy that you want to take a load across the country, if you have to get it across without an egg breaking, maybe not the guy to drive the Indy 500, but they're both great drivers. It's different. And
let me explain. In Special Forces, you have to be airborne qualified.
Yep.
In the Rangers, you do not have to be airborne qualified.
you don't have to be.
You don't have to. You can, but you don't have to be. Right.
Yeah.
And these are the elite units in the American military.
Ranger School, as it's evolved, is primarily a leadership laboratory, test tube laboratory, incubator. It teaches an awful lot of small unit tactics that are applicable to conventional units. They're applicable to conventional units operating behind the lines. They're applicable to special forces and special operations. But it's a leadership and small unit tactic laboratory. The primary teaching vehicle is the patrol, and it may be a 5-man recon patrol or it may be a 25-man combat patrol, but it's a patrol. You go almost everywhere on the ground or in what we call FLRBs, funny little rubber boats. Ranger School does incorporate helicopter activities and parachute jumps now. So if you've got a class going through Ranger School, half of it may jump in to one objective and the other half walks into theirs. But it's leadership. The Special Forces is training for a much longer term operation than a patrol. A patrol is overnight. A patrol is 4 hours. A patrol is 2
1 week,
weeks.
yeah.
Special Forces operations can be a year, can be 2 years.
Behind
So,
the lines.
Yeah, behind the lines in
Right.
somebody else's
Yeah.
country,
Right.
in some place
Training.
where you're not supposed to be, where the some of the locals welcome you and the rest are trying to collect the bounty. So it's a different mindset, and the Ranger does his fighting. He may have artillery support, air support, battleships, cruisers,
Right.
whatever you've got offshore, satellites, predators, all that.
Right.
The Special Forces guy may have some of that, but his primary combat tool are the indigenous people that he's training,
Right.
organizing, equipping.
To make guerrillas.
To make guerrillas,
Guerrillas,
or to make
make
conventional
conventional-
forces,
oh.
to make. I mean, we're unfortunately right now we're sending 100 special forces over to Uganda,
Right.
a mission I strongly object to. But their job is to help the Ugandans capture a guerrilla warlord.
But I mean, Special Forces were in Nigeria and other places in Africa and all over the world. I mean, it's nothing new. It's just this got more PR than usual.
Well, we've sent special forces to a lot of places where we had vital U.S. interests.
Right.
Vital U.S. interest.
Right.
Where there was a threat or a potential threat to our security, our economic interest. Vital interest. We did so with the blessing of the Congress of the United States. This, unfortunately, last week, this announcement by the President was an aberration. He did it on his own. He did it without the approval of Congress. He used War Powers Act to notify Congress, but there's no vital interest.
But you know that Special Forces operations are done without an act of Congress, and they go into countries and train, whether it's Central America or Africa or Asia.
There's a huge difference, Dean,
Okay.
in sending troops into a place where we have a status of forces agreement with a local country,
Right.
with a legitimate or semi-legitimate leader, dictator maybe, but he's the guy. Where we have the State Department has recognized that person's country, and we send people in to train by invitation. That's a whole different ball game than sending people in where we don't have a status of forces agreement, where there are no vital U.S. interests.
So you're just saying that Uganda is actually a backwater and it's no interest to American foreign policy?
Well, if you look on the map, you'll discover quickly that Uganda is landlocked. And
That's correct.
the
But we're talking about Greater Congo and all those other countries where this particular person is involved.
this guy has been fighting a guerrilla insurgency, and admittedly a ruthless and brutal, and he's done a lot of bad stuff for 23 years. Okay, it's one of the outfalls of unintended consequences. You know, we got rid of a real bad dictator in Uganda, a guy named Idi Amin Dada.
I remember
Idi Amin killed 300,000 people. He used to eat his enemies.
With that, that's true. With that, we have to start to end this show. So if you're eating out there, I'm sorry.
Sorry about dinner, yeah.
I just want to say, I want to thank you for coming. It was an insight in regards to foreign policy and how Rangers and Special Forces and Airborne operate, those three elite units that I consider. So we have to wrap it up, and I have to thank you for coming back. Coming here, come back. We'll talk about Vietnam and other things in that respect.
Anytime.
And we'll talk about Uganda.
rationing. And the Screen magazine, in its second issue, tried to explain to me and he wanted to know that what he could do if they were improved. It was a greater city, become a monument to the courage and faith of the upstanding Americans. Buffalo hunters who went in breaking up the from these broken streets and thundering ruins, there moved a greater.
Hello, my name is Ian Conchover. Today we have a gentleman who was in Vietnam. He was an officer in Vietnam. He was a Pathfinder, Special Forces, Rangers, Infantry, anything that I miss, Airborne, Master Parachutist, a lot of other little things. Explain what Pathfinder is to the audience, by the way. This is our second show, and we left off where Mike was in Airborne School, and we were talking about his Airborne and Special Forces and Rangers School. So explain what a Pathfinder is, because a lot of people in the military and not in the military don't know what a Pathfinder is, because that's what you did in Vietnam. So let's
Pathfinder started out in World War II. We had gone from no airborne whatsoever to where we built 2, and we're building 2 more airborne divisions.
Right.
We eventually had 5, or the equivalent of 5 at the end of World War II.
Right.
We used them first in combat in the invasion of North Africa to take to secure a beachhead in North Africa from the Vichy French.
This is in Algiers.
In Morocco and Algiers.
Okay.
We then went on to invade Sicily using a full airborne division, the 82nd.
Did they jump in? Or
They
did
jumped.
They jumped.
Most of them jumped in.
It's considered an airborne combat jump.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Africa was the first,
Okay.
and then Sicily. The jump in Sicily proved to be a nightmare in terms of failing to understand how to use the assets. And as a result, many of the aircraft flew over the invasion fleet of ships down below. And the sailors on the ships, not knowing one airplane from another and being scared, were shooting at the troop carriers above them.
U.S. and British ships and
U.S. and British
allies.
ships, landing craft and other ships of the fleet, of the invasion fleet, because half the troops were coming ashore over the beach, the rest were coming down from the air.
Wow.
So we had, and they were flying low because 1,000 feet was the jump altitude in those days. That's pretty damn close if you're shooting at a transport with an anti-aircraft gun. And we had transports that were shot down. We lost a lot of troops. It was chaos. Accidents of war, yeah. Did the chaos help us? Yeah, because the troops were so scattered, the Germans ended up thinking we had 3 airborne divisions, and we only had part of 1. So it created chaos. But out of that terrible experience came the idea that we needed special paratroopers to go in ahead, mark landing zones, drop zones, so that the air fleet coming in would know precisely where to drop the paratroopers. So that was started in World War II. And the mission was to go in ahead in small teams, mark the drop zones with lights or big fires, use radio beacons, different ways to make sure the transports got where they were supposed to go.
Strobe lights?
Everything. And although it didn't work perfectly in Normandy, it worked better. So it was tried in the following jumps, both in southern France and in the jumps into Arnhem, and then later across the Rhine River into Weissel. So it got better, and the airborne continued to use Pathfinders and to train Pathfinders and to experiment with ways to make sure the airplanes got over the right piece of ground and turn the green light on at the right time. By the time Vietnam rolled around, we were using Pathfinders not only to conduct air drops, but to coordinate helicopter assaults. So the Pathfinders would go in with the first lift, or even sometimes ahead of the first lift.
How far ahead? Hours ahead?
Minutes.
Minutes.
You don't want to be out there all alone by yourself and advertising that, hey, there's a party about to happen. No, you get in there maybe 2-3 minutes, 4 minutes ahead. Sometimes a little longer. I went in earlier on one or two where you have to clear off trees or obstacles, whatever. But you get in, you make sure that you've got a well-marked LZ so that if when the main fleet of lift ships come in and things have started to get a little hairy, there's something on the ground that they can see and recognize and adjust from, that the gunships can see something, usually a letter. You usually lay out bright colored panels in a letter. Smoke, if nothing else, colored smoke.
Different color?
Different colors of smoke.
What color?
Oh, our favorites were yellow, white, red, green, purple, and that's, so we...
Was there a distinct color for a specific mission?
No, the only thing most of us standardized on was red smoke meant a hot LZ. So a hot meaning that they were shooting. So
LZ means landing zone.
Landing zone, yeah. So most of us would wear a red smoke grenade on our web gear, so that all we had to do was yank the pin and it would fall, and it marked where we were, approximately, and it let everyone know there's bullets flying down here. And that changed the course of the operation, and people would make different decisions based on the fact that this was not a bus run, this was a hot LZ. And so that's what I was trained to do that prior to going over to Vietnam. I had come back in the Army. I'd been out for a while and come back in with the intent of just serving my 2 years and going to Vietnam. So I went to the Pathfinder School, which is at Fort Benning. It's a part of the Airborne School.
Right.
It's 5 weeks.
You have to be airborne to be a Pathfinder?
At that time you did. At that time you did. Nowadays they've got Pathfinders who are not.
Right.
But
doesn't mean they're not courageous soldiers.
Nah,
Yeah.
it just means they're legs.
Legs is a term that the airborne troopers used against people who were not airborne, and they would call them legs because to move into a combat situation, they use your legs.
Use your legs.
Where they parachuted in, and they had to use their legs after they parachuted anyway, so it didn't really mean much.
So yeah, today there are lots of Pathfinders who have never jumped out of an airplane, but at that time, you had to be airborne qualified, and you had to be pretty decent at it in terms of, by then steerable parachutes had become more normal, and you had to be at least good enough to steer your parachute within a small target area. We had talked the last time about not getting in the trees. You don't want to be hanging out in the trees half mile away when you're supposed to be down there directing aircraft.
So controllable means you
could steer.
You steered it into the position.
Yeah, and
so I mean, can you jump 50 miles away and steer it into the target area?
50 miles.
Or 30 miles?
Well, with some of today's very modern steerable parachutes and jumping at very high altitude, which is called halo, high altitude, low opening.
Right.
I don't know if they could get 50 miles, but they can get a good 10. Wind dependent.
Right.
It's not something you want to do every day. For the kind of operation I was involved in then, if we were going to make such a jump and try and steer in some place that for some reason the planes didn't want to fly directly over, we'd have a standoff of maybe 10,000 feet, 2 miles up, and then try and steer in. Wind is always the factor, and you have to have really well-trained jumpers for that. And at the Army at that time, we didn't have that luxury to have them that well-trained. Typically, the young Pathfinders that I had in Vietnam had made their 5 qualifying jumps. They had maybe made 4 or 5 more in Pathfinder school. So these were 10 jump kids. And fortunately, we didn't have to jump into any LZs in Vietnam.
I just want to tell you in regards to what he's talking about jumps today, you can parachute jump over Nashua and land in Lowell.
Oh yeah.
No problem. You could, and pushing the envelope, you could jump over Manchester, New Hampshire and land in Lowell.
If the wind gods were with you,
right?
If a little breeze comes along,
and you were well trained,
yeah, but
you can do it.
It's not something you want to plan an entire military operation around.
Right.
It's when you start injecting that level of chance and probability into an operation where lives are dependent.
Yeah.
You know.
But 1 or 2 guys can go from Manchester to Lowell in a jump if.
That's leaving the aircraft very high,
Right.
spending a lot of time on oxygen.
We're talking about miles high.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
and you're still a target up there, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about well-trained people nowadays who can jump out of commercial aircraft with oxygen and can land.
Well, they can jump out of C-130s too.
Oh, C-130s, yeah.
It's just not. It's those kind of operations tend to be for your special operations people. They tend to. We do have people who train for it on a regular basis. You try and find another way in. I mean, I love jumping out of airplanes, but you know, if you have an entire military operation dependent on what that guy is going to do on the ground, and he has to be on a certain piece of ground to do it, you want to maximize his chance of getting there. So, you try and find another way.
I'm gonna. Boy, this thing is heavy.
Yeah, it is.
Pathfinder. These are the guys in Pathfinder.
These were my guys.
These were
in the 1st Cav in 1972, operating out of Benoit and covering most of the 3 Corps area.
Right. Young. They look young.
And I was skinny once.
That was you in the middle. What's that, lieutenant? Is that?
I was a lieutenant. I was a 1st lieutenant.
What's that yellow thing on your?
That's the same. That's the same wings. That's the full-size wings that I have on this hat now.
Okay. And what's the yellow? The yellow tab behind the wings, is that yellow or?
Yeah, it's called a flash. It's basically different colors for each unit.
Each unit.
And that was our.
I know. I don't want to.
Yeah, we don't want anything to happen with it. I don't know how those kids managed to do that. This arrived at home after I'd been sent, after I de-roast, and those kids had managed to put that together and had a Vietnamese vendor do that, and I was so amazed.
Wow.
I was.
You must have been shocked.
Oh, I still am. I can hardly. Well,
tell me about the guys. First of all, let's go back.
Well, I'll help you.
Okay.
I arrived in Vietnam in August of '71.
All right.
Thinking the war is all but over, because almost everyone thought the war was over. Ended up in the 101st, up in the northern part of the country, called
101st Airborne.
called I Corps. It was the Roman numeral 1, and everyone pronounced it I Corps.
Right. Vietnam is broken up into 4 corps.
Yep.
I Corps 2, 3, and 4. It goes from north to south.
Yep.
This is South Vietnam.
So I am living the dream. I get to the 101st. I'm going to get to wear a 101st Airborne combat patch. I envied the guys from World War II who used to wear that back in Campbell when I was a young soldier.
Yep.
And I was set to be a rifle platoon leader.
You were gung ho.
It was gung ho was maybe not the right word. I was intent on doing a job for a year and going home, being done. And I got shanghaied, as it were, by a guy I've almost forgiven. The 101st had a little in-country charm school you had to go through for 2 days or 3 days. And so on the second day, helicopter lands, a scrawny little lieutenant comes over, calls me out of class and says, "You're a Pathfinder, yeah? You're going to work for me." "No, I'm not." "Yeah, you are." "No, I'm not."
Now, he was a first lieutenant?
He was a first lieutenant.
And you
I
were
was a first lieutenant. So there was this little tension and hostility. Like, who are you? I'm the Pathfinder detachment commander. Well, I'm going to go over here to an infantry outfit and lead a rifle platoon. No, you're going to work for me.
Why did he take you out of all the officers?
He was short. He was short officer.
Oh, he was short. Okay.
So he went away, and the next day, I figured I'm going to go join my rifle company. And a helicopter lands, and two of the biggest sergeants I've ever seen come out, and they've got very clear instructions. They go get the instructor. He points to me. "Sir, you are to come with us." And one of those fellas, we used to call him Lurch. He was about 6'7".
Wow. Wow, as a Pathfinder, huh? Wow.
It wasn't any doubt that I was going with them. So as it happened, I arrived at what we call Varsity Valley in Camp Eagle, and they gave me a briefing, and we went up to the officers' club, the little officers' club next to the mess hall, and a wonderful fella named Brainiac. Brainiac.
Wow.
We all use call signs.
Right.
We didn't use our real names. We used call signs.
So your name was Iron Mike? Is that?
No, actually, back in those days, my call sign was Scotsman.
Okay. Our call sign was Vacant College.
Yeah. So anyway, Brainiac is a fella. I'm still in touch with him. Steve Campbell, wonderful man. Prior enlisted. Was on his second tour. They had a mission going the next day, and I would be going along sort of in an observe and work role. Brainiac sat me down, and in 3 hours, must have pushed 2 years worth of knowledge into my head. It was awesome. It was a little overwhelming. His teaching technique is something I've tried to emulate. And the next morning, bright and early, we saddled up and went flying off up north to take a battalion of South Vietnamese soldiers into the hills just south of Khe Sanh. By now, Khe Sanh had long been abandoned.
Exactly.
But an operation was taking place over in Laos called Lam Son 820 and 821.
I'm familiar with that.
And these guys were to help cover the retreat of the South Vietnamese who had gone into Laos. So we end up, my first day was, my first operation was to help run the pickup zone for one battalion, and then move to the second pickup zone and help the second battalion get off the ground.
To pick up the
Yeah, I was shipping them out.
Right.
The first one went very, very well.
You had all your equipment, rifle and
Oh, yeah,
everything,
yeah.
Grenades and all that stuff.
But it was from a relatively safe forward area.
In Vietnam.
In northern Vietnam. In northern Vietnam.
You were in North Vietnam?
In northern.
Northern part of South Vietnam. Yeah. Okay, got it.
So that first operation went off almost without a hitch. It took maybe an hour, and it was pretty much textbook. It was one of those things you wish you'd videotaped, because that's the way it should have been done.
Right.
So we pile on the birds, and we go to help out the crew on the second LZ or PZ. And that's when the North Vietnamese decided to greet me. They threw a 2.5-ton truck in the air to greet me.
How do they do that?
They put a great big charge in the road the night before, and as we were coming in low to land, and I'm looking down, and here's a deuce and a half, clearly a Vietnamese deuce and a half,
And somebody was driving.
full of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, because their families would live with the troops. It was going around right down the road. We were going down over the road. They were going down the road, and all of a sudden there's this big explosion, and here comes a truck. Up, up, up. And I'm covered with what I thought was blood. It later turned out to be mud. So I start calling in a medevac, and we had a very shaky landing. Our two chin bubbles had been blown out.
Chin bubbles are the bubbles in the front of the helicopter.
Front of the helicopter.
Yeah.
The helicopter.
Which is understandable because the blast came up.
So we had a shaky landing. Our two guys were okay. They had a lot of plexiglass in their legs, but they were okay. Mm-hmm. And we went back to help the people who had been blown into the air. And this truck had come up if we were at 100 feet, this truck came up 90. I mean, it got really close.
Wow.
And so we spent a little time patching and bagging those people as best we could. Amazingly, there were injuries. There were no traumatic amputations. No one was killed.
Wow.
We got them all out of there.
But you had a mission.
And then went on to the PZ and finished that mission at that PZ. And then I guess my minder, the NCOs who were with me, the seasoned NCOs, they must have told the boss he's ready, because the second day I got to go on the LZ. And so the second day we did a similar operation. We took another battalion onto another hillside south of Quezon San by about a click and a half. And beautiful morning, picturesque, scared, like a movie. 60 ships in line, 20 seconds apart, heading up in the dawn, up into the mountains. Mm-hmm. One of the most breathtakingly beautiful things I've ever seen, and I was a pucker factor of 9.9 in closing. And I had done a little mischief that morning, so I was, as scared as I was enjoying the mischief I'd done. I'd met the press that morning. Some Vietnamese.
No, let me ask you a question. All the pilots were American pilots?
Oh yeah. At this time, all the aviation assets involved in this operation, 100% American.
Okay, got it.
But a Vietnamese colonel had come up to me with a gaggle of reporters and said, "These guys have to go along." And I said, "No, not. Oh yeah, you got to go." And the American over there looked at me and said, "Yeah, they got to go."
Are these all American reporters?
No, this was an international gaggle of scum. So I said, "Okay, we can do that." And I went to the second bird, and I got all the Vietnamese out of the second bird. I took them and farmed them out to the following birds. Mm-hmm. I said, "You reporters, this is your bird, your limousine ride. You're the second bird in. You're going to get a great..." And they were scared. "You can't do that. We'll be on the ground without any protection." "You want to ride? That's your ride." So the second bird in was all press. You talk about people with... I never had another reporter for the rest of the year go on any operation with me. My name was already made. It was the best thing I did that day. So that was one funny story. I was enjoying that as we rode in.
Right.
And so we landed on the side of this thing, and I had pretended like I was an old grizzled Pathfinder when I talked to the aviation guys. I was, don't be stabbing these guys with screwdrivers, because unfortunately, you land on the side of a hill. Hills like this, helicopters like this. Mm-hmm. For the guys on this side, that's a 2.5, 3 foot jump. Mm-hmm. For the guys on this side, that's 8, 9, 10 feet.
You could break your leg.
And if you only weigh 100 pounds and you've got 50 pounds of gear, that's a leg breaker, okay?
Right.
So there were American crew chiefs and door gunners who had a bad habit of stabbing Vietnamese with screwdrivers to get them out of the plane. The Americans didn't want to hover and wait any longer than they
Right.
had to because they were exposed. But if you put a guy out on the wrong side on a hillside, you know, you're just going to put him back in about 4 birds later because he's
Exactly.
going to have a broken leg.
But, yeah.
So, but getting out on a hillside is a little dicey because those rotor blades are very close. They got to get out. They got to crawl. You know, so it takes a little while. And if they're
You could get hit by the rear rotor blade, too.
you get hit by the overhead
Yeah,
one
yeah.
if you go uphill.
Yeah.
So, we were 20 seconds apart, and it was taking a good 15 to get them off and move them out. And it was working, and I was doing the ground guiding. I had 2 sergeants with me who were very senior, one of whom was one of the guys that kidnapped me, shanghaied me. And so they went up on the ridge line, and they were working the radio. And I was doing the ground guiding and getting the kids off the bird and that kind of stuff. And I was vaguely aware that there was a cobra, or a pair of cobras, working a ridge line a little south of, or a little north of us, a little lower.
A Cobra is a different type of
Gunship,
helicopter.
gunship.
In
Same
those days.
airframe,
Yeah.
different mission. And so anyway, 60 birds came and went, and we packed up some wounded. We already took wounded on that operation, and put them on the last couple of birds out. And when we were all done, the Vietnamese battalion commander gave us a handshake and a salute, say, "You go now." And we said, "Thank you very much, sir." And we got on the last bird and flew home. And this is where I began to learn humility.
That's unusual.
I'm sitting
For you,
back,
Mike.
I'm sitting back, I'm thinking, oh, that was a good day's work, and I'm smoking a cigarette and enjoying the view, and one of the sergeants said, "Sir, you sure were brave." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You just kept on ground guiding." "Yeah." "You didn't know they were shooting at you?"
Who?
And I'm thinking, they're setting me up, they're setting me up. "No, what?" He said, "You didn't see us call in those airstrikes?" I said, "Well, I knew something was happening." "Yeah, they were shooting at us with Cal 50 from
Wow.
the other ridge."
50 caliber machine gun.
I had been totally unaware of it, with the noise of the helicopters right in my face.
Right.
I had not heard, I had not seen a round impact. I was blissfully unaware.
I like that term.
And so I end up with this reputation for being brave, when in fact I had been totally unaware. I'd looked over my shoulder a couple of times and seen, yep, they're on the radio there, and they're giving me, "Okay, sir, good to go, don't worry, okay." That's all I needed to see, was these 2 old grizzled guys giving me the high sign. I had nothing to worry about. I could play ground guide.
Did they give you a medal for that?
No.
No. Okay.
No, but I got a lot of ribbing. I still get teased from these guys from this. Well, one of them passed away last year.
40 years later.
I still get teased about it. But I ended up with this exaggerated reputation, which I didn't deserve. But sometimes a reputation can be useful. And that's
Good point.
it's one of the things I learned very quickly there was, because I was older than the average first lieutenant, because I had served as an enlisted man, and many of the officers in the 101st in 1971 had known me as a private and a Spec 4 and a sergeant.
Wow.
Okay, they all assumed I had 2 or 3 tours under my belt.
Oh.
And came this moment
We got to wrap it up, so go ahead, get to the...
in about 2 weeks, when I realized that I had to be very careful of what I said, because I would be taken as a seasoned expert, and I wasn't. So I had to be very careful what I recommended, what I said. And
With that, we've got to end this show. We're going to have you come back again
Okay.
and talk more, because I mean these stories are immense, and I think the public should know what went on in Vietnam.
War II.
rationing. And the Screen magazine, in its second issue, tried to explain the reason.
And he wanted to know that what he could do if they would improve. In all the greater cities become a monument to the courage and faith of the unsouthern Americans. Buffalo hunter who with his breaking oak and the old wild from these broken streets and
Hello, my name is Ian Cartover, and today we have a gentleman. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the history show. Today we have a gentleman, Mike Farquhar. He was a first lieutenant in Vietnam. He's a ranger, special forces, master parachutist with over 100 jumps. Was initially an enlisted man out of Arizona. Went in the military for 3 years. Went in airborne, right? In
Yeah.
the first 3 years, artillery, airborne. I said you had over 100 jumps. Went to Vietnam. We were talking in the last show about his experiences in Vietnam. And he was talking about how he was involved in this operation with South Vietnamese units in I Corps, which is a northern part of South Vietnam, I have to tell you. And how the crew people on the helicopter would push out the South Vietnamese troopers with screwdrivers. And usually what happens is a helicopter will hover probably 2, 3, 4 feet. They would never land. And then the soldiers had to jump off the skids. And if they didn't jump, or if they were afraid, because you can break your leg or break your ankle, or, they would push you out. The American crew chief members would push their own personnel and South Vietnamese out of the helicopter because they didn't want to sacrifice the ship. Is that correct? I mean, yeah, more or less.
It was a fear factor.
Okay,
It was a helicopter comes into a hot LZ, or one that might become hot, meaning gunfire.
Gunfire.
And you're 2, 3, 4, 5 feet off the deck, and maybe there's a lot of vegetation under here. It's hard for the pilot to see exactly what's there. They would hover, and for that moment, the bird is exceptionally vulnerable. And crew chiefs and door gunners were mostly first-term enlisted or drafted soldiers. Their hearts and minds weren't necessarily in this war, and
At that time period when we were talking about 1971.
The least exposure, and they would carry screwdrivers. Right, there's a big pole that the gun is mounted on, and they would have screwdrivers in there, which they would use for clearing jams. But going into hot LZ, if there was any reluctance of the Vietnamese troops to get out, they would end up using these to literally stab at them, and all it would do in the end is cause us more injuries. We'd end up evacuating 4 or 5 Vietnamese soldiers who had broken ankles or broken legs, totally unnecessary. And the culprits were the door gunners and crew chiefs, and it was hard to control. So I had to make very sure on a number of operations that the door gunners and crew chiefs knew that if I saw them doing it, because I'd be on the ground, they'd get court-martialed. And I had to very carefully make sure that that didn't happen. It was a needless casualty, and it was a needless antagonism between the Americans and the Vietnamese. It just didn't need to be.
Because what happens is also, you've got these guys that have rifles, whether they're American or South Vietnamese forces, who have rounds in their rifle. They can easily turn around and shoot that member, and
Yep.
I'm sure it's happened.
It probably has, sometimes you reap what you sow.
You were talking about this operation in northern part of
Well, it
South
was
Vietnam.
it was a fairly large for that point in our involvement in
Right.
the war, which was decreasing by the day.
Right.
That was a fairly large operation. It was to cover the withdrawal of South Vietnamese forces who had gone into Laos to clean out North Vietnamese forces who were gathering to attack.
And what happened?
There were more North Vietnamese than the South had planned for that we knew about. It was not pretty over there.
This was a South Vietnamese operation.
It was a South
completely,
Vietnamese,
100%.
mostly South Vietnamese. Some American advisors and special forces went in with them. allegedly didn't cross the border, but probably did.
Yeah.
But it became very clear that the North Vietnamese were just across the Laotian border in huge numbers. That was the area called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was not a trail. It was, for all practical purposes, it was an 8-lane highway. But they were there in great numbers, well defended, well organized, weren't about to be pushed out. And the handwriting at that point, to me, and to a lot of my associates, was on the wall, that this war was not over, that they were simply waiting for the Americans to go home. And as it happened, I arrived in the 101st in August, and we got...
what year? I'm sorry.
71.
Okay.
71.
Right.
This was the last American division in country, up north in I Corps. And we got orders, we're going home. And I don't even want to discuss what happened for the next month, but we packed it up, we shipped it out, or we buried it. And far too much of it we buried. In fact, a couple of little funny stories.
You're talking about the engineers came in, dig trenches, and just threw the stuff, equipment in there.
They dug something that looked like an open pit copper mine from Arizona. It was eight deep, 8 rows of road deep.
Right.
And we filled it.
Wow.
A couple of funny little vignettes, just so the American taxpayer will fully understand how your money gets wasted. To dig a hole to bury some stuff up at Camp Evans, which had a nice runway, they encountered something hard and dug a little more and said, "This looks like part of an airplane." And they finished digging and dug up an F-4 Phantom jet fighter.
Wow.
It had Marine markings. It did not have a tail hook. It was an Air Force F-4 Phantom.
Okay.
They cleaned it off. The Air Force came in and finished cleaning it off and fired it up and flew it out of there. Turns out, many years before, a couple of Marines had gone over to Thailand on a 2-day R&R. You know, Marines, they're going to drink.
Right.
They're going to forget. They're going to do silly things. They decided to go back. They didn't want to wait for the flight. They went down and stole an Air Force F-4 Phantom and flew it back. And their crew chief, of course, was going to take care of these young lieutenants. He repainted it with Marine markings. They continued apparently to use it for another 2 years.
Wow.
Now they had a problem. The Marines were going home. Ooh, what do we do with an Air Force? Bury it. They buried it. Honest to God, they flew. One of our fire bases, Birmingham, they too decided they needed to, as they were going to abandon the fire base, they needed to dig a big hole and bury all the garbage. They dug, they found something hard. It was a tank. They dug up a perfectly working tank.
Wow.
And cleaned it up and eventually turned that one over to the South Vietnamese. But somebody had an extra tank, and rather than go through the paperwork of turning it in or trying to explain who stole it, they buried it.
Well, a lot of things are done that way in the military.
Yeah.
People steal things and they have extra Jeeps or extra trucks, and there's no paperwork for
I
it.
may have been guilty a time or two myself.
I think everybody.
But it's all
in
for the
warfare,
mission. Anyway.
Yeah. Did you have a secret clearance?
Yes, I had a secret clearance, I want to say, starting in about 63. And it was renewed when I came back in 70. So yeah, I had a secret clearance.
Did you go on any secret operations in Vietnam?
Who wants to know?
I
may have.
Should I get a beer and we can sit down and talk about it?
If we do this again, let's.
All right, good. That's a good idea.
At the time, it was secret. I think a lot of people know about it now. But once upon a time, an American president was going to do something very unprecedented. He was going to go and shake Chairman Mao's hand in Peking, China.
Right, I remember that.
But China was going through some tumultuous times right then. And there was some question, there was some concern that things could be a little feisty with the American president in Peking. And of course, by now, China was a nuclear power. And we knew that China had been helping the North Vietnamese almost as much as the Russians had.
Supplying them with weapons,
yes,
etc.
everything. So, no sooner had the 101st stood down, and I end up in the 1st Cav down in 3 Corps, and we get...
Which is near Saigon.
Yeah, it's basically the area around Saigon, in the old rubber area, rubber producing area. I get called in, and I'm a 1st lieutenant. I'm fairly old, but I'm a 1st lieutenant. And Mike...
How old are you talking about, old?
Oh, gee, what was I then?
26,
something
26,
like that. Yeah,
wow,
something
that's
like
pretty
that.
old for a 1st lieutenant.
Yeah, it was.
They probably call you the old man.
And now I looked even more seasoned because having come down from the north, I took the 101st patch from this shoulder and sewed it on over here, got the Cav patch over here. I look like I've been around for anyway. So they said, Mike, we got a couple things we want you to plan on. There's one, it's there may be TET of 72, just like there was TET of 68. TET of 70 didn't involve much, but it's coming up to TET time, and you got to get ready for TET of 72. And now we got this other mission. Yeah? Well, let me explain. Richard Nixon is going to go to China, and there's a certain fear that either the Chinese Army will grab him and hold him hostage, or the Chinese Air Force will grab him and hold him hostage.
Wow.
Because there's a little tension in China between the two. And Mao Zedong is getting old, and Zhou Enlai is, and I said, no, this is a lot.
Right.
I said, and why are you telling me this? Well, because the 3rd Brigade separate of the 1st Cav is the last, only, and nearest American unit to Peking, China. If Nixon has to be rescued, we're it. And I'm thinking, trying to desperately remember how many million soldiers the Chinese Army has.
Right.
And I know that our little separate brigade was maybe 5,000 soldiers. And I'm thinking, and they said, and you're the Pathfinder platoon leader.
Oh, wow.
Guess what? If we need to use that airport to get in there to get Nixon out.
But you wouldn't know where he was. It's a city of millions. It's a country of millions.
All I know is that I had a contingency mission
Wow.
in January of 1972 that if anything bad happened with Nixon's trip, we were going, and I was going in with my kids first.
Jumping in by parachute?
That would have been a jump in, yeah. That was going to be a jump in. And meanwhile, get ready for TET of 72. Well, fortunately, Nixon went to China. Everything was nice. They raised cocktails. He got out. Done. TET of 72 did not happen. February came, nothing. Quiet.
Right.
And it didn't get nasty until April Fool's Day. The last day of March, April Fool's Day, all hell broke loose. The North Vietnamese pulled the mask off guerrilla warfare. They pulled the mask off any pretense that this was a homegrown insurgency. And they came across the DMZ with 3 divisions. They came down through Pleiku with 1 division, and they came down from Cambodia in Budap and An Loc with a division and a half. And these were Russian-styled, Russian-trained, armored and mechanized divisions. They came across the DMZ up north with tanks literally hubcap to hubcap, and they smashed through the 3rd ARVN Division, which we had just trained and put in place, and then got as far as the Perfume River and Quantry, and were stopped there by the 1st Army Division, which was probably their most seasoned. In my area, down south, we were stunned. I mean, we suddenly had North Vietnamese tanks literally drag racing up and down the runway at a town called Loc Ninh, which is right on the border. It's an old Special Forces camp. And what had happened is these kids had driven these tanks down from North Vietnam, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, waited, till finally they got the whistle blown and told to go. They went balls to the wall as fast as they could. They got to Loc Ninh, looked around, here's this great big PSP, RSP runway, the first piece of open flat terrain they'd seen in a long time.
Which is probably what, how many, 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet?
Yeah, it was about, I think it was a 4, I don't know.
If it's
I only saw that one once and from a distance. A big distance. But, you know, North Vietnamese teenagers aren't much different from American teenagers. You show them that piece of ground, and they started drag racing tanks.
No kidding.
And that was the only thing that saved the day, because that gave our Air Force and the South Vietnamese Air Force a time to start hitting them. We had a small contingent of Americans with the Vietnamese there, a wonderful fellow named Zippo Smith. I finally got to meet him a few years later. He held out for 3 days. And we all thought he was dead because the last call was to target his own bunker. And his story we could talk about some other day. It's just a remarkable story.
Is there a book out about this guy?
I think so. You can Google him, Zippo Smith.
Okay.
Legendary American soldier, just absolutely legendary. And he bought enough time for the South Vietnamese to send their 1st Airborne Brigade out of Saigon into a town called An Loc, which is south of Loc Ninh. They fortified the town as best they could, because as they were getting out of their trucks, North Vietnamese tanks were appearing. North Vietnamese tanks eventually broke through and drove all the way through.
Usually their elite units were good.
Yeah, their paratroopers, I will tell you from personal experience, were probably the bravest soldiers, man for man, on the face of the earth at that time. They were just incredible. I am proud to wear their wings, and they were awesome. So for 7 weeks, that brigade of ARVN paratroopers, South Vietnamese paratroopers, held off a division and a half of North Vietnamese. They were surrounded.
With tanks. I mean, they had...
With tanks. This was a Soviet-style armored division.
Conventional.
Okay. The North Vietnamese had heat-seeking missiles, the Strela, the SA-7 heat-seeker. They had radar-guided 50 cal and radar-guided ZSU-23-4s, which is an awesome, scary machine. They had a lot of artillery. They had a lot more they captured from us. And they surrounded the town. And you did not fly below 10,000 feet without risking your life. Our brigade commander, our assistant brigade commander, a colonel named Casey, his call sign was Silver Fox. He lost 3 fingers off his right hand flying his helicopter at 10,000 feet. 50 caliber bullet came through. Now you think 10,000, that's 2 miles up. Okay. That kind of accuracy is only achieved with radar. When I finally got to see An Loc, which was weeks later, toward the end of when they were surrounded, the ground around An Loc for a mile in any direction, it was as if a kid had dumped all his Matchbox toys and scattered them. Down helicopters, down fixed wings, South of Anlock, along QL-13, the South
Highway 13?
Yeah, QL-13, Highway 13. The Vietnamese had tried to relieve the town. They tried to rescue the town by sending an armored cavalry regiment up the road. We had trained that armored cavalry regiment. At that time, that was probably the best trained armored cavalry regiment anywhere in the world in anybody's army. It was the best of the best of the best. They drove up that road to try and break through that and relieve that town.
Mm-hmm.
Very much as Patton had tried to relieve the town of Bastogne in 1944.
Right.
Well, they ran into a 7-mile-long linear ambush.
Wow.
They fought like hell, but they were ambushed.
7 miles long.
7-mile-long
Wow.
linear ambush. And when I finally got into Anlock, there were 3 armored personnel carriers left, 2 of which the back doors wouldn't close. Everything else was destroyed. The entire regiment was wiped out. And as you flew north along QL 13 and looked out, it was the scariest thing I've seen. Tanks turned upside down, turrets popped off, everything wheels up, treads up. It was a hell of a battle. It lasted 3 hours, but in 3 hours, the North Vietnamese wiped out an entire armored cavalry regiment, and almost to a man. So these guys, these paratroopers, stayed in that town along with the civilian population for 7 weeks. They were resupplied by air, not very well, not very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
We still don't have that trick down. And then finally it was time to relieve them. And I got to lead the relief. I got to plan and lead the relief, which was really scary. But, you know, we didn't have much to work with. We had a little piece of ground that we owned. Of that, there was only some of it that could be landed on. It was all under both direct and indirect fire. And it was very scary. And our first attempt, we went in the morning, and in 20 seconds, the first 4 birds, 2 little birds and 2 snakes, were shot out of the air. 4 birds, 8 Americans killed. One of the snakes managed to land, and I watched, because I was on bird number 5, the first lift bird. No reporters this time.
Didn't want to be.
No reporters. And I was watching, and the bird landed. It fluttered in, and the pilot and co-pilot got out. And the North Vietnamese just came out of the wood line and just mowed them down. They had their hands up, but they murdered them. But that was my introduction to the SA-7 missile, because 3 of the birds were shot down by SA-7s. And the one that fluttered in was shot down just by massed small arms fire. And you cannot believe how fast those SA-7s are, and they don't miss. They don't miss. You see a streak of smoke, you see a helicopter explode, then you hear the bang, and then you hear the second bang, and by that time the bird is in flames, or the bird has exploded in midair. And so in 20 seconds, we lost 8 aviators.
That's why we don't use helicopters as much in Iraq and other places like that in regards to...
Well, just as a little aside, viewers, this past week, our administration finally admitted that as a result of our failure to plan in Libya, 20,000 Soviet-made SA-7 anti-aircraft missiles, capable of reaching up to 2 to 2.5 miles into the air, are missing. 20,000 heat-seeking anti-aircraft missiles, any one of which can bring down a jet plane, commercial jet plane, a helicopter.
Who was selling them the 20,000? That's what gets me.
The Russians.
Yeah.
The Russians were taking Gaddafi's cash, because
Yeah.
Gaddafi had
Yeah,
a lot of
money,
cash,
yeah.
and there's 20,000 of those little suckers now missing. Some stories say they're for sale on the streets of Cairo at $4,000 apiece.
Well, let me ask you a question. I know that was an aside. You were in the Army early in the 60s, and you were in the Army in the late 70s. What was the racial and drug problem that you saw in that time frame?
Oh boy, that's a whole nother half hour.
Well, we might have to stay another half hour.
In 1962, we had one soldier in our barracks who would make a major production on a Saturday night of smoking one marijuana cigarette. He was from California. No, we just thought it was funny. We just thought it was funny because he'd make this big production of smoking this little thing, and he'd take 4 or 5 puffs, and then he'd put it out, and he'd put it away. No one knew what it was. In 1962, nobody knew what it was. I came back in the Army in 1970. The drug problem was epidemic. Epidemic. Marijuana, heroin. Marijuana, heroin. Mao Zedong is credited with saying to somebody in 1966 that he was going to destroy the American Army in Vietnam with heroin. He damn near did it. Outside the hooches, the little makeshift barracks the troops lived in many units, you would find these little plastic vials every morning, and we'd have the troops police them up. These little plastic vials were made in Hong Kong. They contained heroin, almost pure. And it was available to the troops for $2 and $3. And the addiction was epidemic. My unit was the Pathfinders. We had one barracks. Next to us was a rearm platoon. Their sole mission was to rearm Cobra helicopters, put fresh rockets in them. They were 27 to 30 guys. When the North Vietnamese attacked on April Fool's Day, these guys were so stoned, so drugged out, they couldn't even walk. And when they heard that the North Vietnamese were attacking, they took more. They were literally laid out along a berm, asleep. And we had to grab a platoon of South Vietnamese infantry and very quickly show them how to load rockets into the pods on the helicopters, because that fight was going on right now. And there were 27 Americans gone. When I had first arrived up north in the 101st in August of '71.
We got 1 minute, so.
On my way to dinner, someone pointed to a kid and said, "He's overdosed." So I did my CPR and we got him back. The next night, same thing. Same kid, same place, overdosed. Did CPR, got him back. The third night, I walked by him. I let him, it wasn't worth it. And that was the level of the drug problem.
Wow. What about racial problem, real quick?
Horrible.
Okay.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrible.
Yeah. And we're a better Army now, right? So
We
you
are-
don't believe in the draft?
A draft of a different kind, I think, would have been a good thing. I think for many generations in this country, the draft was the great equalizer. No rich kid was immune. Unfortunately, the draft didn't do much for Al Gore except give him political talking points. It didn't make him a better person.
Listen, we got to end this show.
All right.
Thank you for coming. Great stories about the military, and I hope your future is a good one. Iron Mike, as they call you, and maybe we'll have you back someday and talk more
hope.
about Vietnam. Thank you very much.